Lake Superior, deep within the rugged forests of northern Michigan. The earth is violently scarred by ancient excavations. For decades, explorers mapping the peninsula expected to find the usual remnants of quiet ancient settlements and villages. They looked for simple tools, the faded signatures of survival moving slowly through the long passage of time. But the landscape revealed something incomprehensible. Thousands of deep trenches had been aggressively carved into the hard bedrock. An unimaginable fortune of pure metal had completely vanished. What lay hidden beneath the soil stopped the scientific community. Who took it, and where did it go? The answers to these ancient enigmas are out there, waiting. If you're fascinated by these hidden chapters of history, please hit that like button and subscribe to Echo Mysteries. Drop a comment with your own theories. Every interaction means the world to us. It gives us the drive. Let's bring the truth to light. Together. The year is 1667. The air is thick with damp cedar. Father Claude Alouez, a Jesuit missionary, pushes through the dense undergrowth, following his Ojibwe guides along a winding river. The water is dark and freezing. The sky above is a heavy, bruised gray. This land is sacred. They speak of the metal with hushed reverence. To the Ojibwe, copper was a gift, a spiritual talisman. The priests watched as the guides stopped near the Ontonagon River, pointing toward a massive shape in the water. It was a monolithic anomaly in the wilderness. This was the Ontonagon boulder, weighing over 3,000 pounds. It was a colossal lump of nearly pure, native copper. The missionaries were stunned by the bare metal. In Europe, copper was found in deep veins mixed with rock, requiring smelting and intense heat to extract. But here, the metal lay bare. It was raw, vulnerable, as if it had been dropped by a giant. The surface of the boulder was worn smooth by centuries of rushing water. Shining under the gray sky, it glowed with a dull, reddish-green patina. Father Alouez reached out to touch the cold metal. He could feel the weight of history under his fingertips. The Ojibwe did not use iron or steel. They did not have the furnaces of the old world. They worked the copper with stone hammers and fire. They cold-hammered the nuggets into delicate fish hooks and sharp knives. They treated the metal as a precious resource. Every piece was accounted for in their oral traditions. But here is where the silence becomes deafening. Now listen carefully to what the explorers noticed next. As they moved further inland, they found more. They found chunks of copper buried in the roots of fallen trees and pebbles glinting in creek beds. The abundance was incomprehensible to the European mind. It seemed like an endless supply of metal. The missionaries wrote letters back to France describing a land paved with gold-like metal and industrial wealth. They saw a resource waiting to be claimed. The Jesuit records speak of the wonderful power found here. They described how the indigenous people guarded the locations. There was a quiet peace in the woods. The relationship between man and metal was one of balance. The Ojibwe took only what they needed. They did not gouge the earth or leave deep scars. They left the landscape intact and beautiful. To the casual observer, it looked like the copper had been there since the beginning of time. It looked as if no one had ever tried to take it all. However, the peace was an illusion. The missionaries were standing on the edge of a massive archaeological ghost story. They saw pure surface deposits. They marveled at the single, heavy boulders. They believed they were the first to realize the true value. They thought the land was virgin and untouched. But as they mapped the region, they noticed something strange. The ground was uneven. There were depressions in the earth and trenches overgrown with old-growth timber. The Jesuits began to wonder if they were walking over the graves of an older civilization. They saw remnants of ancient pits filled in by time. The trees growing inside were hundreds of years old. This meant the work had stopped long before the French arrived. It had stopped before the Ojibwe ancestors took control. The scale of the work was hidden by the forest. It was a secret kept by the soil itself. The missionaries only saw what was left behind. But what they saw on the surface was merely a fraction. Fast forward to the middle of the 19th century. The American industrial machine was finally waking up. Prospectors flooded the rugged northern peninsula looking for fresh veins to fuel a rapidly growing nation. They brought heavy machinery, chemical explosives, and the sheer arrogance of the modern age. These men expected to break ground. But every single time they found a promising geological site, someone had already been there. The ancient trenches were not isolated incidents scattered by chance. They were parts of a vast, interconnected industrial complex. There were thousands of them hiding beneath the forest canopy. Some pits plunged 30 feet deep into solid bedrock. They were connected by surprisingly sophisticated drainage systems. The sheer scale of the engineering defied the popular simple image. Moving that much earth without steel tools or steam engines requires a multi-generational commitment. It requires thousands of workers striking stone against stone, day after day, century after century. Then the mining engineers started doing the math. They surveyed the perimeters and measured the cubic volume of rock. They calculated the average yield of copper per ton. They realized the ancient workers were not just picking nuggets. They were breaking the spine of the earth. To get 1 pound of copper, they had to move basalt. The resulting numbers were entirely staggering. According to these early structural estimates, an incomprehensible amount of rock was excavated. The corresponding amount of extracted copper was equally terrifying. 500,000 tons, 1 billion pounds of pure metal, vanished. It was gone without a single trace. This implied an industrial-scale extraction that spanned thousands of years, operating long before the wheel was supposedly introduced to the continent. The native population certainly respected and utilized copper. They crafted beautiful ceremonial tools. They made sharp hunting weapons and intricate personal adornments. But 1 billion pounds. You could supply a modern military force with that kind of incredible tonnage. You could build an entire fleet. The archaeological record of the Americas simply did not reflect this kind of massive material wealth. No massive bronze cities. There were no copper-paved roads stretching across the continent. The metal was not stockpiled in the native burial mounds. It was not traded down to the great empires of the Aztecs or the Incas in that volume. The pits are real. The missing stone is real. The empty physical space is undeniably real. But here is where the narrative mutates into something entirely unhinged. If the indigenous tribes did not keep it, who mined it? And where did 1 billion pounds of metal actually go? Nature abhors a vacuum. The human mind absolutely despises an unsolved historical mystery. In the total absence of hard answers, speculation filled in. The missing copper became the ultimate blank canvas for the fringe. Desperate theorists began looking across the ocean. They pointed directly to the Bronze Age empires of Europe and the Mediterranean. The Minoans needed endless supplies. The Phoenicians were already known as legendary maritime sailors. The resulting hypothesis was audacious and highly contagious. It proposed secret transatlantic shipping routes operating thousands of years before Columbus, hauling American copper for the Trojan War. Some writers published books claiming the lost city of Atlantis used Michigan as its personal hardware store. When terrestrial explanations still felt insufficient, others looked up. They looked to the stars. The theories evolved. Ancient astronauts operating massive mining lasers, harvesting planetary resources before disappearing back into the dark cosmos. It sounds absurd today, but when you are standing at the edge of a silent pit staring at rock, rational thought begins to slip. The void demands an explanation. Meet John. He is 45 years old. A seasoned geologist operating out of a stark, climate-controlled laboratory at a Michigan university. For 10 relentless years, he has chased the ghosts of the ancient copper miners across the rugged landscape. He is not looking for alien spaceships or sunken Atlantean barges, but for something far more undeniable. He is looking for the chemical fingerprint of a colossal industrial machine hidden deep within the Earth's layers. On the steel table in front of him lies a long, transparent tube filled with dark, stratified mud. It is a sediment core pulled directly from the deepest, coldest trenches of the vast Lake Superior. To get this core, his team spent weeks on the freezing, unpredictable waters of the Great Lake. They drove hollow steel pipes deep into the lake bed to pull up uninterrupted columns of ancient time. This tube of dirt is a perfect, undisturbed geological clock, capturing every single year of human history. Every single millimeter represents a year of history settling silently to the bottom of the cold water. It is a physical ledger of the Earth's memory, recording every change in the environment over millennia. The logic driving his decade-long obsession is brutally simple. You cannot carve 1 billion pounds of rock. You cannot mine the Earth without leaving a permanent, toxic scar from the violent, messy industrial process. When an empire shatters bedrock and burns massive fires to crack stone, they release microscopic particles. They release heavy metals into the sky, specifically trace amounts of lead bound to the native copper. The wind catches this ancient industrial dust, and the rain washes it down from the pulverized hillsides. Eventually, all of that microscopic debris settles into the water and sinks deep into the dark mud. If a forgotten civilization exported 500,000 tons of metal, the evidence is locked inside this capsule. It would be an undeniable chemical stain, a signature of industry waiting to be discovered by science. John knows exactly what a heavy industrial signature looks like on a glowing computer monitor. He has seen the massive, jagged spikes in data marking the arrival of European colonists in the 19th century. He has seen the dark markers of the modern industrial revolution screaming across his digital screens. The myth of the missing 500,000 tons has hovered over his entire academic career like a shadow. It was the elephant in the room at every archaeological conference he attended over the last decade. Now, he is calibrating his mass spectrometers to look further back into the dark, ancient past. He is scanning the specific layers corresponding to the period between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago. He is hunting for the grand climax of the old copper complex. The machines hum steadily in the quiet lab, burning the ancient mud samples into plasma. The computers begin to map the isotopic ratios. John is holding his breath, expecting to see the definitive proof of the greatest resource heist in human history. He expects the graphs to rise. He anticipates the chaotic, apocalyptic pollution of a thriving mega-civilization tearing the landscape apart. But here is where the data becomes particularly fascinating. The screen does not show a massive industrial spike. It does not show an apocalyptic surge of lead isotopes raining down upon the ancient lakes. It shows a completely flat, unremarkable baseline. There is a slight, gentle elevation indicating small, localized campfires and basic manual hammering. But there is absolutely zero evidence of a massive, coordinated extraction network. The data is entirely dead. The silence of the spectrometer is absolutely deafening. The colossal plumes of toxic smoke never existed. The phantom armada of shipping vessels never sailed. John sits back in his chair. As the staggering realization finally hits him, the computer isn't broken, the timeline isn't corrupted, the entire world has simply been blinded by a spectacular, mathematical lie. The illusion of the missing £1 billion was not created by an ancient mystery. It was entirely fabricated by modern greed and incredibly poor mathematics. When 19th century mining companies first surveyed the Lake Superior Basin, they were actively looking for wealthy investors. They looked at the ancient trenches and made massive, sweeping assumptions to inflate the value of the land. They multiplied the maximum depth of the deepest pit by the maximum width of the widest trench. Then, they boldly assumed that every single cubic foot of missing rock was completely saturated with high-grade native copper. This was a catastrophic error in basic structural logic. In 1999, Dr. Susan R. Martin, a highly respected archaeologist at Michigan Technological University, completely obliterated this myth in her research. She explicitly categorized the famous 500,000-ton figure as the direct result of ill-constructed estimates. The early prospectors took the richest, most unusual anomalies and blindly projected them across the entire geographic region. They created a phantom fortune on paper to justify their own industrial ambitions. There was never an advanced foreign civilization stealing the metal. The copper was never there in those wildly exaggerated quantities to begin with. But the real, definitive proof is written in the atomic structure itself. The archaeological community did not just stop at correcting the historical math of the Victorian era. They brought in the heavy artillery of modern physical chemistry to seal the coffin on the transatlantic conspiracy theories forever. In 2024, a groundbreaking study published in the peer-reviewed journal Archaeometry, featuring research tied to Indiana University, looked directly at the elemental evidence. They utilized advanced lead isotope analysis to track the precise chemical signatures of the native copper deposits across the Lake Superior Basin. Every geological deposit on Earth has a unique, identifiable isotopic fingerprint. When humans aggressively mine, crush, and process metal, they inevitably release microscopic traces of that specific chemical fingerprint into the surrounding environment. If an ancient empire had systematically extracted 500,000 tons of copper over several millennia, the regional sediment would be screaming with lead isotopic pollution. The 2024 analysis confirmed exactly what the corrected mathematics had already suggested. The isotopic data conclusively showed that the scale of ancient extraction was entirely small, highly compact, and geographically scattered. The chemical record reflects a completely sustainable, localized operation. It perfectly matches the capabilities of small bands of indigenous miners working seasonally over thousands of years. They were incredibly skilled at tracking and following the thinnest, most lucrative veins of pure copper through the hard basalt. They extracted exactly what the rock offered and absolutely nothing more. The official historical and scientific position is now absolute. The grand, sweeping theories of European maritime armadas or extraterrestrial harvesters were built on a flimsy foundation of bad arithmetic. The missing 500.00 tons of ancient American copper never vanished into the dark void of history. The billion-pound ghost ship simply never existed. When we strip away the sensationalism of ancient aliens and imaginary European galleons, we are left with a historical truth that is far more profound. The real empire of Lake Superior did not need to cross an ocean to build its legacy. Between 5,000 and 1,200 years before the Common Era, the indigenous peoples mastered the stone. They did not possess the roaring smelting furnaces or the toxic metal foundries of the Bronze Age world. Instead, they relied on profound patience and an intimate understanding of the earth itself. They utilized thermal shock, lighting massive fires against copper-bearing basalt and then rapidly dousing the glowing rock. Dousing it with freezing lake water to violently crack the stone, finally exposing the precious metal nuggets. Once the metal was exposed, they extracted the raw nuggets and relied entirely on the technique of cold hammering. With heavy stone mauls and incredibly steady hands, they coaxed the raw copper into complex, durable shapes. So, if the copper did not leave the continent on phantom ships, where did it all go? The answer lies not in a secret stockpile, but dispersed across a vast, intricate web of human connection. The metal flowed south and east, feeding directly into the magnificent trade networks of the Hopewell and Mississippian. Imagine the bustling ceremonial plazas of Cahokia, a sprawling indigenous metropolis that rivaled medieval European cities. The copper from the freezing northern lakes made its way to these massive earthen pyramids in the south. It was carried on foot and by birchbark canoe across thousands of miles of deep American wilderness. Instead of being cast into brutal weapons of war, the metal was transformed into essential instruments of life. It became sharp awls for sewing winter garments and heavy, barbed fish hooks to harvest the great rivers. It was meticulously beaten into stunning breastplates, elaborate headdresses, and delicate ear spools for their leaders. The great missing fortune of North America was never missing. It was simply traded, gifted, and worn. It was worn proudly across the chest of a thriving, monumental civilization right here at home. We are often too eager to invent phantom fleets rather than accept the brilliance existing right beneath us. The true story of the Northern Copper forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable bias regarding ancient history. The metal never vanished into mythical empires. It was woven into the lifeblood of indigenous nations who understood the earth far better than those who later conquered it. If we are so willing to construct impossible fictions to explain away the monumental achievements of Native Americans, what other magnificent truths about the original masters of this land are we still actively choosing to ignore?